In 2019, German football team Hertha Berlin poured 111 million euros into player recruitment alone, the third highest in the country, only behind Borussia Dortmund and Bayern Munich. It was a statement of intent, part of a 375 million euro investment, and it made sense. Berlin, the capital of Germany, had long been a major city without a major club in Europe's biggest competitions. However, 2 years later, they were relegated and the owner was forced to sell his stake amid accusations of employing former Mossad spies against fellow board members. What? Where did it all go wrong? As far as intros to episodes, this one is one of the stranger ones, but I guess all of this is just my way of saying that sometimes money is not enough. When Chelsea and Manchester City made their big money splashes on the global stage, an opinion seemed to permeate the general football atmosphere that all you really needed to take over was to bring a fat wallet to the table. If only that were true. Many clubs will be quick to tell you that things don't work that way. Lord knows that the majority of the clubs that would tell you this had to learn that lesson the hard way. In this episode, we're looking at 4 extreme cases of cash-flush football teams who got themselves into truly unique situations and suffered horrendous consequences thanks to their ambition. I'm talking about teams that gambled it all and lost the house. I won't let anyone burn through 375 million euros there, and therefore I will never give up and will make the investment a success, even if it takes longer than originally planned. Words of Lars Windhorst, owner of Hertha Berlin in early 2022. These words came almost 3 years after taking control of the club. They don't exactly fill you with confidence. Windhorst was a serial entrepreneur, a man who achieved success very early in life, labeled as a wunderkind, holder of the Midas touch, perhaps the kind of owner that a fan of the club would be excited to see take over their establishment. That is, of course, if they didn't look into his 2 previous declarations of bankruptcy before joining the club and convictions for embezzlement. But going into the details of that is beyond the scope of this episode. Going back to the football, his investment into Hertha went into paying off existing debts, player recruitment, upgrading staff facilities, and various consultancy fees. The pitch was simple, perhaps too simple. Berlin is a big city, the German capital, in fact. Yet, this is not reflected in their local football clubs. After all, the capitals of just about every major footballing country in Europe house footballing juggernauts. Hertha, having finished in 11th the year before and had put together about a half a decade of mid-table Bundesliga consistency, were in a decent starting position to climb the ladder. So began the shopping spree in 2019-20. 110 million euros spent on players, all of that versus 139 million in revenue from the previous year. It was a big bet, and some big names at the time arrived. Matthias Cunha, Christoph Piatek, Lukas Tossart, to name a few. In fact, the top 4 signings in the club's history all came over the course of that year, and the season started with a surprise hint of a potential plan in place. 2-2 against Bayern München at the Allianz, but within weeks it all fell apart. By November, the manager was gone, and Hertha was already in a relegation battle. All it took was 12 weeks. Big man Jürgen Klinsmann arrived, but by February he was gone. 11 weeks. Next was Alexander Nuri as interim. 9 weeks. Bruno Labbadia then rounded off the season. Klinsmann told Bild that managing this club was a suicide mission, citing a lack of support and trust. He didn't exactly shower himself in glory, but he may have had a point. Tactically, the squad wasn't built for one clear way of playing. Big outlay, mixed profiles, and no stable reference point. Do we press high, sit deep, build slow, play direct? Thanks to their January signings, somehow the team managed to finish a place higher than the last year. But that's where the miracles ended. The big spending days were a one and done, with the performances taking a nosedive. 10th, 14th, 16th, 18th. That is how their finishing positions read as the years went by. Relegation only a few years after spending more than almost everyone else. And if the on-field drama wasn't bad enough, get a load of this. In the boardroom is where the real drama unfolded. In July 2021, Berlin prosecutors had opened up a criminal investigation into Lars Windhorst Windhorst over breaches of the German Banking Act, lending and deposit-taking activities without the necessary banking licenses under German law. Hertha Berlin's name was constantly in the news because of this. Whatever the legal outcome, club owners making their club a subplot in someone else's courtroom is never a good look. And then came the scandal that made this whole thing go from owner grievances and perhaps, a mistake here and there, to the realm of international espionage. Yes, you did hear that right. In late 2022, the internal problems at the club had reached a tipping point. Windhorst made no secret of wanting Werner Gegenbauer, the club president at the time, fired. He felt that Gegenbauer stood in the way of him essentially being the total decision maker. However, because of the Bundesliga's nifty 50+1 ruling, even as the majority shareholder, Windhorst could not fire the president. So he did the next best thing. In 2021, Windhorst secretly hired Israeli intelligence agency Shibumi Strategy to conduct a smear campaign on Gegenbauer in a bid to push him out. Check out this extract from the Times of Israel newspaper on the topic. Shibumi's strategy to oust Gegenbauer, president of Hertha BSC since 2008, involved sending field operatives to speak with members of his family, social circle, and prominent fans. Throughout the entire period of the project, a team of more than 20 managers, field operatives, former agents, campaigners, OSINT analysts, web designers, content writers, and German native speakers were recruited to the project and all worked together days and nights for 12 months. Bro, surely there was a better way of doing this. Anyway, it worked. Gegenbauer stepped down in May of 2022 due to mounting criticism on his leadership. I wonder what lit the fuse. Knowledge of this campaign was only made public after the agency Windhorst hired sued him in Israel over missed payments of 5 million euros. At this point, it didn't take a genius to realize that this whole thing was too messy to continue. So, by late 2022, 777 Partners, 777 Partners, a Miami-based multi-club investment group, agreed to buy Windhorst's 64.7% stake. Oh, and by the way, remember the name 777, they will pop up again in a future story. The fee was a reported 65 million euros, a far cry from the near 400 million invested. However, it appeared that Windhorst was expecting even more based on performance-based related stipulations and deferred payments. A lot more. Although there was reason to believe that perhaps those expectations were unrealistic. One such stipulation was winning the Bundesliga. An interesting clause, seeing as by the time this information was made public through a court hearing cross-examination, Hertha had already been relegated. So, Hertha Berlin was essentially branded as the quote-unquote big city team. But when you promise the people the Champions League and deliver a relegation scrap, they tend to not believe in your branding. And to add even more layers of irony to this, rivals Union Berlin qualified for the Champions League the same year that Hertha Berlin went down. So, I guess Berlin got their big city team after all. Before we begin this section, I would like to personally deduct 10 points from Everton's current points tally. I'm sorry guys, it's just business. Case number 2, Everton under Farhad Moshiri. In February 2016, Farhad Moshiri walked into Everton acquiring a 49.9% stake for a reported £200 million. He kept incrementally increasing it, and by January 2022, he was 94.1% in control. Moshiri was a highly acclaimed man of business well before Everton, an Iranian-born British citizen, an accountant by training, previously a minority owner of Arsenal with deep links to Russian oligarch Alisher Usmanov. By Moshiri's own account, he only became an Arsenal shareholder because of Usmanov. Quote, "The reason I got into Arsenal was because my business partner is a crazy fan of Arsenal and we do most things together." End quote. That's what I mean when I say deep links. As for the Toffees, everyone remembers the so-called Big Four of the Premier League from the 2000s. Manchester United, Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool. In truth, for large parts of that era, Everton were not far off. A trip to Goodison Park was never something to be taken lightly. As the years went by, that aura began to fade and Moshiri felt he was capable of bringing it back. How? Revving up the money printer, that's how. By his second season, 17-18, only Manchester City and Chelsea were above them in the Premier League spending charts, as they launched £160 million into the transfer ether. To be fair, in full context, This is not as unjustified as it sounds, given that they sold £110 million worth of players in the same window, the bulk of which being Romelu Lukaku for 75 and Ross Barkley for 15. But what ultimately made the output unjustified is where the money ultimately went. Some good players came in: Jordan Pickford, England's current #1, Michael Keane of course has been great, combined £50 million. Then we have Theo Walcott, whose legs were gone, for 20. And Gylfi Sigurdsson for £40 million. To this day, Everton's most expensive signing of all time. Not the worst signing at the time, good player, but perhaps this one was a minor mistake. All in all, between 2016 and 2024, Everton had spent roughly £750 million on transfers. However, while they were spending like the big boys, their results looked more like an inversion of their contemporaries. In what feels like a fever dream, Carlo Ancelotti managed them. James Rodriguez signed only to leave a year later following Ancelotti's return to Madrid. Rafa Benitez, once on the other side of Merseyside, was one of their own, as was Frank Lampard, as was Ronald Koeman. None of them were able to get the best, or much at all, out of this team. For each coach that came in, there was no structure, no plan, no hope. 7 full-time managers and 3 caretakers in 8 years of Moshiri between 2016 and 2024. Everton fans have been through a lot, and not in a good way, because while all of this was happening, the trend of finishing positions through the years makes for some very grim reading. 8th, 2017-18, 8th again the next year, 12th the year after that, 10th, 16th, 17th, 15th by 2024. In all honesty, it remains a miracle to this day that this club never faced relegation at any point. The last time Everton were not in the top division was in 1953, so this would have been huge. But they stayed the course. Miraculously, they stayed the course in 2023, where they narrowly managed to escape on the very last day of the year. Of course, this was thanks in large part to some irregularities we'll soon discuss. But perhaps it wasn't the managers at fault. How can it be when the sporting directors of the club above them were changing like Donald Trump's tariff policies? 3 directors of football in the same time frame. Perhaps the most disappointing from an expectations perspective was Steve Walsh, the sporting director who was responsible with scouting Riyad Mahrez, Jamie Vardy and N'Golo Kante for Leicester, players that cost Leicester just under £11 million combined. After over £100 million worth of transfers and recommendations for Everton, he couldn't replicate the heroics, which is fascinating because he also claims that he recommended Erling Haaland, Andy Robertson and Harry Maguire to Everton for a combined total of £23 million in 2016, all of whom were rejected by Moshiri's board. If true, what a world we live in, and what a world we could be living in. Backtracking a tiny bit and going off the pitch, Everton's commercial vehicles were deeply tied to companies linked to Alisher Usmanov, whom I mentioned earlier. Russian oligarch, a 30% owner of Arsenal at one point, and Moshiri's long-term partner. In January 2017, Everton struck a deal with Usmanov's USM Holdings firm that renamed the Finch Farm training ground to the USM Finch Farm for a reported £12 million a year, along with over £20 million a year in various sponsorships. All good. Fast forward to 2022 and the goalposts shifted. A war in Ukraine had broken out, instigated by Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. Usmanov was caught in the crosshairs of the European Union and was described as a, quote, pro-Kremlin oligarch with particularly close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin. He has been referred to as one of Vladimir Putin's favorite oligarchs, end quote. Everton swiftly cut ties with Usmanov as the sanctions came crashing down on him. Remember, this is a man that was a long-term associate and partner with owner Moshiri. It was not looking good. For the financial year of 1920, at least £42 million of Everton's £64 million sponsorship receipts came from Usmanov Holdings alone. Of course, in the midst of all of this, Everton were in the middle of planning and building a new stadium. USM had pledged £30 million towards stadium naming rights options. Everton's new stadium, the Hill Dickinson, was supposed to be the monument to the era. Instead, it became part of the financial regulations breach story. By 2022, Everton had posted 3 consecutive annual losses of over £105 million, putting them in breach of the league's profit and sustainability rulings, or PSR. Everton's accounting and the stadium financing formed a large portion of these breaches. Add on to that a global pandemic and bleeding expenditure with no fans to fill the void, and what you were left with was over £1 billion in debt by 2024. The result was a 10-point deduction in their position in the log in the 2023-24 campaign, which was reduced to 6 points only to have another 2 points added onto it. And then of course there was the third deduction, which was administered at the start of this episode. By now, word of administration, similar to Chapter 11 aka bankruptcy, were being whispered. Understandably, by this point, Moshiri, he wanted out. Everton's fans were delighted at the prospect of seeing the back of him. And guess who stepped up to the plate? That's right, 777 Partners. Remember them? Owners of Hertha Berlin? For £550 million, they had agreed to purchase Everton. During the period of transition, the Miami-based firm had even committed roughly £200 million towards Everton, all going towards general operational upkeep, debts, and the ongoing stadium project. But things are never straightforward here, are they? 777 were having significant structural issues, being described as a quote-unquote house of cards in one of the many lawsuits against them. Most of the money they had provided Everton with came through loans using collateral they either had no ownership of, was already promised to someone else, or was fabricated. Long story short, there was serious doubts that 777 could meet the Premier League's funding requirements to actually complete the deal, so it fell through. However, after years of obscurity, the deed was finally done, and on 19 December 2024, the Texas-based Friedkin Group completed its takeover, ending Moshiri's reign. For everyone involved, I would say that was probably the best outcome. The power of sports to influence the masses really does know no bounds. Truly, there's no telling what you can accomplish under the right circumstances. The circumstances, however, in this chapter, they may not have been ideal. In January 2011, Suleiman Kerimov, a Dagestan-born Russian billionaire, the second oligarch to feature in this episode, bought Russian club Anzhi Makhachkala. The oligarchs and football would probably make for a great video on its own. In this case, though, the goal was simple: put Makhachkala on the map. A tall ask. Anzhi Makhachkala is a team born in 1991, based in the city of Makhachkala, Dagestan. Dagestan is the largest Russian republic in the Caucasus. Strategically, it is extremely important to Russia for several reasons, perhaps the most major being its proximity to the Caspian Sea, and therefore a trade route linking Central Asia and China with Europe. However, life in Dagestan is widely reported to perhaps not be proportionately great in comparison to its importance to Moscow, known for its rampant violence as well as being a hotbed for rebel activity amid growing Islamist insurgency. In 2011, at least 824 people were recorded as conflict victims in Makhachkala. There were roughly 86 explosions or acts of terror in the same year, with 111 law enforcement personnel killed in shootings, bombings, and clashes. At the same time, Suleiman Kerimov was worth roughly 6 billion euros, making him the 118th richest person in the world, according to Forbes. He's had his share of alleged controversy, but being of local origin, it was only fitting that he was tasked with cleaning up the image of his region and developing it further. Of course, the chance to attach himself to the most popular sport in the world and gain global recognition for his efforts were a known side effect, but why dwell on this? As the story goes, the handover wasn't exactly a purchase per se. Suleiman Kerimov was given a 100% stake in the club by the state in exchange for a 9-figure euro investment in the Makhachkala area, which is why signing Samuel Eto'o for 25 million euros and making him the highest paid player in the world at a reported 20 million euros a year was the solution to all of this. A wonderful solution to uplifting the community where the average monthly salary stood at about 350 euros. And in case you'd forgotten, Eto'o had just become the only player in football history to win back-to-back European trebles with 2 different clubs only 1 year prior to this purchase. He was still only 30 years old. The word on the street was that he was off to Manchester City's growing project. Instead, brother moved to Dagestan. This was a big deal. A couple months before Eto'o, Roberto Carlos arrived. Yes, that same Roberto Carlos. He was 38 years old at this point and probably thought his days of fat checks were over. He was wrong. This club featured a young pre-Chelsea Willian, Yuri Zhirkov, Lassana Diarra, Christopher Samba. All in all, 450 million euros is reported to have been spent on players and infrastructure between 2011 and 2013, with 300 of that on players. Anzhi Makhachkala were a then 20-year-old club. with no record of major success other than 2 second division wins, one of which came in 2009. On the pitch, a winning cultural shift did at one point look to be on the cards. In 11-12, they came 5th in the Premier Division. In February 2012, Anji hired Gus Hiddink and they finished 3rd in 2012-13, reached the Russian Cup final, and got to the Europa League last 16. A good start, however, it would not get better. A real shame for some because the club had sky-high aspirations. The planned construction of a new stadium brought hope that perhaps World Cup games from the upcoming 2018 World Cup held on Russian soil would make their way to Dagestan. There were rumors that the club were preparing a sensational attempt to trigger Lionel Messi's release clause at Barcelona, 250 million euros at the time. Even if true, he was too busy scoring 91 goals in the calendar year to respond. Makachkala were rumored to have offered Jose Mourinho, then Real Madrid coach, £1.8 million a month to take over as manager, but it all fell apart. Perhaps the signs were there from the start. Was it when UEFA ruled that the club couldn't host Europa League games in Dagestan for the 2012-13 campaign, explicitly citing security reasons, meaning the club built to represent Dagestan played European games in Moscow? Was it the fact that the players themselves lived and trained in Moscow and took a 3-hour private jet to Makachkala for home games? Was it the racism problem, a known problem in the Russian league? Being a club that made international recruitments a major part of their model, this was inevitable. There were so many reported incidents of racism, I'm sure it's difficult to count. Every game, bananas were thrown on the field. One of the times it happened, the abuse was aimed at captain Roberto Carlos. He walked off the pitch, never returned. Of course, it wasn't just the foreign players that were receiving abuse. Some fans were pictured giving Nazi salutes and chanting slogans such as "Russia is for Russians" or "Caucasians, go home." I don't know, Chief. It's hard to build a winning or even likable culture when you can't even display basic humanity. Was it financial fair play and just money in general? Among all the issues, this was probably the biggest. In August 2013, Kerimov decided to drastically cut Anji's funding, citing a new budgeting target of roughly 60 million euros, an 80% decrease from the 300 million player investment from just 2 years prior. The decision was made in direct response to the club's financial fair play standings. It was also the matter of Kerimov's personal wealth taking a turn as share prices of his companies began to dip for non-footballing reasons. The writing was on the wall. So you probably won't be surprised to hear that the exodus of players was immense. In reality, it was likely all of these things that led to the collapse of this team, and in the eyes of the oligarch owner, I'm sure he felt he had nothing to show for it all, and he clearly did not have the patience to sit it out. By the 2013-14 year, they were relegated, only 3 years after the start of the big spending. By 2016, the club changed ownership. Sometimes, being rich is not enough. From a rare European spending extravaganza, our final tale comes from a place a tad more familiar to the modern football fan: oil money. In Spanish football, the tale of a club in financial crisis, hemorrhaging debt, and being on the brink is a common one. Malaga FC were not the exception. By June 2010, they had just dodged relegation from La Liga in the 2009-10 season by a single point, had 17 million euros in debt, and were desperate. These numbers may sound small to fans of the big boys, but make no mistake, they were staring at a steep incline. And so, in their desperation, the club president at the time, Fernando Sanz, found himself in Qatar searching for suitors. He found them. As per Malaga's website, the suitor came in the form of, quote, prestigious Qatari businessman Sheikh Abdullah bin Nasser Al Thani, coincidentally a member of the Qatari royal family. 36 million euros, and the whole thing was his, setting off a sequence of events that, again, to quote Malaga themselves, quote, converted Malaga FC into the fastest growing club in Europe, end quote. The goal of the new ownership was, again, simple, like many of the stories in this episode: exponential growth. In their case specifically, it was becoming the third best club in Spain. You might be asking, why weren't they more ambitious? To which I would reply, come on man, you know that's not realistic. This was 2010, and the start of Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo's reign of terror in Spain. I think that's all that we really need to say to tie up that line of thought. To be fair, Malaga gave it a good go. 85 million euros was spent in strengthening the squad over the next 2 seasons, 25 in the first, 60 in the second. Even as recently as early 2010, That was a sizable chunk of change across the entire continent. Julio Baptista, Joaquin, Toulalan, Saviola, Di Michaelis, Nacho Monreal, Santi Cazorla, Matthijssen, Van Nistelrooy, and the crown jewel was a 19-year-old Isco plucked from Valencia. And to make things even spicier, they only went and recruited Real Madrid's most recent coach, Manuel Pellegrini. This was an interesting acquisition for a lot of reasons. Firstly, Pellegrini was extremely unlucky to not be in a job. This is the chart of Real Madrid's top 10 best ever league finishes in La Liga. Over here is their second highest ever, 96. A towering figure, that's for sure, but still a figure that stood in the shadow of Barcelona's 99 points that same year. Pellegrini was let go. And fair play to Florentino Perez, Pellegrini's replacement popped off in 2012 and achieved the club's best finish of all time and left Pep Guardiola with egg on his face, 100 points. A Jose Mourinho special. As for Pellegrini, his job hunt didn't last for long as he arrived in Malaga in late 2010. The first phase was the fun phase. Pellegrini brought structure, compact lines, patient build-up, and a midfield that could go against the best of them, something proven by the fact that in 11-12, Pellegrini's first full season with the club, Malaga achieved a historic 4th place finish. The townsfolk probably couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Malaga is ranked the 6th largest city in Spain, an absolute football-mad country, whom coincidentally had just picked up the World Cup around this period in time. They owned a 30,000-seater stadium. However, the city's major team had never truly ranked amongst the country's elite. Until now, the 2012-13 season marked the first time in the history of the club they featured in the Champions League. They topped a group featuring AC Milan and ultimately reaching as far as the quarterfinals, where they were knocked out by a Jurgen Klopp-led Borussia Dortmund side. And depending on who you ask, perhaps they should have gone further. Malaga led Dortmund by 2-1 in the 91st minute and looked semi-final bound, only for Marco Reus to equalize and Felipe Santana to send the Westfalenstadion into delirium. This was the highest point of this period. What a height, indeed. But soon everything would begin to unravel. 6th place was how that season ended. Not a bad placement, especially considering that they were juggling Europe at the same time and had sold Santi Cazorla and Solomon Rondon at the start of the year. But then they fell to 11th the next year, hovered around mid-table for a bit, and ultimately were relegated by 2018. Quite the fall. You could probably guess some of the major reasons for what went wrong here. As early as 2012, Malaga had been investigated by UEFA over late payments to players, a sum of roughly 9 million euros. For that, UEFA slapped them with a 300,000 euro fine and a 1-season ban from all European competitions starting the next year. Meaning, although they did qualify for Europa by finishing 6th, that spot was given to 7th place Real Betis. Interestingly enough, they were the first club to be banned from UEFA competitions thanks to FFP, so thanks, Abramovich. Their appeals fell on deaf ears while their stars headed for the exit. Isco became a star at Real Madrid, Manuel Pellegrini left for Manchester City, and Malaga's Qatari ownership seemingly refused to invest in the club ever again. If you recall, 60 million euros were spent on the players in 2011. That number would drop 90% to a combined 6 million spent between 2012 and 2015. It seems that not all Gulf royalty is as adored by fans as their contemporaries. You see, Sheikh Abdullah bin Nasser Al Thani, the owner, seems to have an unfortunate record for over-promising, under-delivering, and allegedly just straight-up lying. Fast forward to 2020 and Malaga were a mid-table Segunda Division squad. It's not hard to see why, when that very same year, him and his family were suspended from their position in the club's hierarchy by a regional court order. The accusations included embezzlement of company funds, money laundering, and dishing out inflated salaries to family members on the board, including 3 of his sons, i.e., fraud. Many were surprised as this was the same owner that led the Puerta La Bajadilla project, an initiative from the early 2010s that sought to transform a small marina in Marbella, Spain, about 40 kilometers from Malaga, into a luxury super yacht port. After receiving approval off the back of a promised 400 million euro injection, it was believed that this project would provide over 3,000 jobs and become a true landmark of the area. Work was supposed to commence in 2012. Instead, after repeated delays, contractual issues, legal issues, and competing financiers making constant claims that Al Thani's consortium did not have the funds to carry out the project, the Spanish Supreme Court confirmed his company was kicked off the project due to, quote, continual breaches. The year is 2026 at the time of this recording and the project has not begun. Getting back to football, and again, at the time of this recording, Al-Thani remains the major owner, but it's tough to imagine that will last for long. QSI, owners of PSG, FSG, owners of Liverpool, and many more have reportedly been in talks of a takeover. And considering that in June 2025, prosecutors sought out 14-year prison terms for Al-Thani and his sons on the aforementioned fraud charges related to the football club, you'd imagine something will have to give sooner rather than later. So, we've taken a look at 4 extreme cases of financial mismanagement in recent times, but you should know that these are nowhere near the only cases. With the way the world is going, football, a game born of working-class roots, is now well and truly in the hands of private equity. These entities gravitate around a sport that has decades of built-in fandom that continues to grow. Their influence too will continue to grow, but it's clear as day that football is not like any business that many of these investor types has ever encountered. Especially the European sports model, where relegation is an ever-present threat and clubs can disappear overnight. Throw in your classic case of high-level mismanagement, fraud, and shady business dealings, and what you have are stories like these. So, will stories like these be the last of their kind? Absolutely not. So, what's the moral of the story here? Perhaps football is not for everyone. And there we have it. Don't forget to subscribe or follow if you haven't. That's all for me today. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you're having a great day. Cheers, and I will catch you in the next one.